kind of redundant because I think everybody in the room knows that Tim's not here.
We did not notice.
Is that the first time?
It's the first time here that we've done the show with me, the only one physically present, but Tim omnipresent. And I was going to go into some explanation. You may or may not know we had timed this out very carefully so that he would have his hip surgery on Monday, April Fool's Day, and this would be the last day that we could do the show before that. But then they pulled an early April Fool's joke on Tim and said, we're going to do it on Friday. And so we had to decide, sort of in the spirit of show must go on or show must not go on, what we would do. So we decided to go on. I'll explain that in a sec. Tim is out of surgery. He's got 2 new hips. He seems to be in great shape. He just wants to make sure that everybody remembers the pretzels. So what he's done is he's written a score. I thought we could send him a note.
Hip 1.
Hip 1. Hip 2.
Hooray.
I can see this is going to be a hard night.
How do you know everything?
I did with
Parenthetically, I was just going to say, get well, Tim. Oh, you're going to... but hip hip hooray is obviously more appropriate. It turns out hip hip hooray is an interesting phrase. It's an old drinking, it's a prelude to a toast. Apparently you would say hip or hip hip to get like ahem, so people would listen to you. But it also may have had its origins in the Hep Hep riots of 1819 in Bavaria, because HIP is an acronym for the old Latin phrase, which I can't pronounce, Hierosolima est perdita, which is Jerusalem is lost, which is what the Crusaders used to shout. And somebody said that that's what the Bavarians were shouting during this pogrom in 1819. But other people say, no, that's just what the shepherds used to shout at their sheep. So it's a little unclear. It's also unclear whether hooray is actually a Mongol term. So it's a very loaded, okay, so let's hold this up. And can we get, you already did this? Wait, I've already spent one. All right. Everybody cheer for Tim. Woo! All right. Send that right away. Message to Tim and Caroline. Go. Now, get back to business. So he's given you a score. There are tools in there. You follow the score. Larry has the bell every 5 minutes. You'll ring the bell. We anticipate basically chaos with this. We have a lot of professional musicians amongst us, so you could defer to more talented people. You also have the option of not making noise, so you can hear the words, but that's optional as well. I think this is a kind of perfect utopian moment where we have to work out our rules without a leader in place. And I will just try to maintain some kind of rhythm without Tim here. So we may begin, we begin with blowing or clapping. That's a cheap way to get applause before doing anything. So, can you hear me over your own clapping? Okay, except for Mom. So thanks, Larry, and thanks, Adam, for letting us do the show in this wonderful space. The show, there's a really wonderful essay by Kathy Quinlan today. You can look up. You may have noticed that these are all based on logos, which are explored and exploited in various I can see this. I'm just going to keep going if you can hear me. I'll keep my eyes closed. I'll begin. No, don't be shy. I shouldn't whine. So logos sort of go back in some form to sort of the most iconographic images that we have in culture. The caves in Lascaux, cylinders that were used to imprint a signature in a kind of pre-literate Mesopotamia, but they became sort of identified with certain businesses. In, I think, 1398, King Richard II of England decreed that every pub had to have a sign outside that indicated that ale was being served within. This was actually so that the official royal tasters of ale would know where ale was being served, because this was a very important health program, water being so unreliable as a source of non-poisonous libation, that you had to drink alcohol. So gradually a green dragon might be associated with a particular pub, or green dragons in general might be associated with drinking, and so on and so on. Although these sort of logarithmic ideas were associated with clarity, they also were sometimes used to hide or create a kind of secret society within a larger unknowing population. If two early Christians met each other on the road and weren't sure of the other's religious orientation and didn't want to be chopped up, one might make an arc in the sand, and if the other drew a similar intersecting arc to make the image of the fish or ichthys, they knew they were fellow believers and could rely on each other. Similarly, this early Christian symbol was often marked on buildings as an indication of a sanctuary within. It's another acronym hidden in this. It stands for, I think, Jesus Christ, Savior, Son of God. What Adam has done, which I think is really interesting beyond the sort of formal aspects of this work, is that he's sort of taken these logos which were associated with corporations, which we similarly associate through the sort of system of signifier and sign with a certain emotion, a kind of development in the history of logos that started from about the 1950s, so that you would see, for example, the Nike swoosh and associate it with the imperative of just do it, athleticism, and the purchasing of shoes to achieve the kind of ambition that is irrevocably connected to the buying of shoes. By breaking up the logo, we recognize the sign, the signifier, but the breaking down of that continuum means that we don't immediately associate the purchasing, the sort of imperative of the corporation's message to us. We are allowed to question. Nice, our first transition. So for example, if I can it's very hard to do this backwards, but so you'll have to forgive me, Adam, if I mess this up. So if the logo for the Golden Arches, well, I'm just going. Apparently, this is the one that people have the hardest time seeing. So I'll just put Amazon, which I didn't realize. This Amazon is like one of the secret messages that they like to sort of embed into a logo. They sort of subliminally say, okay, Amazon delivers everything from A to Z with a smile. Now, so resist that feeling whenever you buy anything. Anyway, so the logo of the McDonald's arches is supposed to immediately put you in mind of sort of sizzling salts and fats and proteins and sugars, and you salivate and you buy hamburgers. And the sort of Western diet is responsible for our present state of deteriorating health. I'm not arguing that this is responsible for the breakdown in Tim's body, but it's not hard to see the operation that he went through, which we were going to joke about if he hadn't gone through it and he was present to sort of reify, sort of legitimize the sort of lighthearted tone of the serious operation. But since he's come through it okay, I feel I can say what they did today was saw off the top of his femur, hammer in a stainless steel spike with a ball on the end on each side. He did on both hips, then sand out the receptacle, put in, I think, a plastic collar. They did this all from the the posterior, from the rear end, which is, I guess, easier to do. And then people get up and they dance around. I think my sister-in-law, Esme, just had her knee replaced, and she's already going last week, and she's at a baseball game tonight, watching, not playing. Our old dog, Flurry, actually has a knee brace inserted inside of her, which she's still limping around on more and more slowly, but it is possible to. Oh. I'm going to see if they got it. No, it's not them. I was sort of intrigued to find that there was in the 1960s, there was a doctor in Burma named San Ba, who was actually trained at the University of Pennsylvania. We went back to Burma, now Miramar, as an orthopedic surgeon. He realized that ivory was cheaper than metal. And he began experimenting with ivory hip replacements, which he tested and realized that there's a great deal of tensile strength. They have a kind of biomedical benefit. The bone actually grafts into them very easily. And he performed, and they harvested, they said all the ivory came from elephants that had naturally passed on. And they had a scrimshaw expert who would carve the bone, the sort of replacement parts. They had some trouble making sure they didn't shear off, but eventually they performed, I think, over 300 operations with these ivory hip bones, and there's still some people walking around with ivory hips to this day. I tried to convince Tim to look into that, but just a small rundown of the celebrities who've had double hip replacements, or at least Arnold Schwarzenegger, Katharine Hepburn, I think, Eddie Van Halen. I guess that's basically the same drawing, Eddie Van Halen. A lot of rock and rollers. I think Billy Joel had Elizabeth Taylor had no less than three double hip replacements. She lived hard, I guess. Or maybe they just didn't know how to do hip replacements. So I mentioned Esme's knee and Fleury's leg. Our friend Bonnie had a hip replaced and doesn't even remember it. Our friend Anne has both her shoulders and her hips and her knees replaced. Tim is actually on that track. Tim has got both his knees replaced. Now both his shoulders, hips, and then the knees, which are the hard ones, coming up. Kate just had her knee scoped, but does that count? You don't have an actual. Okay, it doesn't. When did you have it done? All right. And you're around? Good. Not to bring everything back to my own story, but I've never had a artificial part of me placed inside my body, but I have had, I had an accident when my thumb was cut in two, and when it was put together, I had these steel rods that were implanted on either side to hold everything in place as the bones had to sort of reset. And then after several months of, my cast came off and they had this oddly bionic thumb that had these sort of antennas coming out of it. And I didn't know what they were going to do, and I'm looking at it from one side, and the doctor's looking at it from the other side. And then he reaches over, and he grabs them, and he just pulls them out, which was a very disorienting experience. Thumbs. So in Vienna, in about 1880, there was a very handsome and talented, you're gonna have to help me with the pronunciation, young physician named Fleischl, who was considered brilliant and charming, and he was the assistant to a pathologist, and somehow he got his thumb in the middle of a pathology exam, horribly mangled to the point where it had to be amputated. But that wasn't the end of the pain that he suffered. He was in such agony that he turned to a common solution at the time, which was morphine, and he became a morphine addict, or what was known then as a morphinist. And this was horrible to watch. He had sort of all these delusions. His friends would watch as he would scratch at his arms to pull out the ants that he imagined were crawling under the skin. Luckily, or maybe not so luckily for him, he was a member of a circle of incredibly brilliant, ambitious young doctors and all around Vienna at the time. And one of his friends was young Sigmund Freud, who decided to do some research into some alternative painkiller for a Fleischl besides this morphine, which was ruining his life. And he settled on cocaine. Cocaine was a drug which had been known in the West since the Spanish invasion of South America. The Peruvians had been chewing cocoa leaves and finding tremendous energy and relief from pain and hunger, and it was often used as a kind of analgesic. Oh, that's appropriate. And it sort of had fallen out of favor for a variety of reasons, which we'll go into. But Freud was convinced that this would be something that could be substituted for morphine because it felt so good when you ingested it, and it didn't seem to have all the obvious side effects of morphine. But he was convinced it didn't really work out for Fleischl. He never kicked any of his addictions. But Freud was pretty sure that there was some great use for this drug, and he wasn't above sort of urging his friends to look for similar solutions. He had a girlfriend in some town at some distance from Vienna, and he went away for about 2 weeks, and he told a couple of his friends they should continue the research into into cocaine. My mind is not so. And one of his friends was this young doctor, Karl Kahler, who was a very dynamic and somewhat apparently short-tempered character, who wanted to become an ophthalmologist. I don't want to say optometrist, ophthalmologist, a surgeon. There was a very prestigious job as an assistant that he wanted, and he was convinced that there must be something that he could do that would earn him this important and needful post. He was kind of broke at the time. And he knew, as did many, that cocaine had the ability to numb the surface of the skin. If you put it on your tongue, you couldn't feel anything. People have been experimenting with this, but they hadn't put it into practice. Because of his interest in eye surgery, he knew that eye surgery at the time was a particularly horrendous and painful procedure to go through. You had to be awake so that you could respond to doctor's commands, and there were no effective pain remedies, so they would actually stick literally a white heart poker into your eye to do this minor surgery. He sort of had this intuition or insight that the numbing effects of cocaine might work on eyes as well. And so this seems to take place in a very short time. He goes to a lab in the hospital, and he asks for a frog, and a very lively frog is produced, and they put a 2% solution of cocaine in water in the eye, and then they poke it, and nothing happens. And they're sort of excited. So they get a rabbit, and they put some cocaine in its eye, and they poke it, and nothing happens. And then they get a small dog, I believe, and they put cocaine in its eye, and they poke it, and nothing happens. And then, I believe to their everlasting credit, they put cocaine in their own eyes, and then they poke each other's eyes, and nothing happens. The success of this local anesthetic is proven, and Kahler writes a paper. He's too poor to actually deliver it at the next big conference, but somebody else does. And by the time Freud comes back from his vacation, Kahler is sort of world famous for this innovation. He has to go on and do something else with his life. But he calls him Coca-Cola in one of his letters, which is incredibly advanced. This is in 1887, which we'll see in a second, means that he came up with this idea all by himself. He also, in his letters, teases Kahler for being extremely serious. I think he says, with you, everything has to be so deep. And you get a letter from Sigmund Freud saying that you look too deeply into things. I think is a wonderful compliment. Kahler goes on to fight and win a duel against an anti-Semitic fellow med student. He doesn't get the job that his great research should have given him. So he comes to the United States and lives the rest of his long life in New York City. And the reason I know this in such detail is that his daughter wrote this all up in this brilliant essay, and his daughter's daughter, Kate, is here with us, and his two of his many great-great-grandchildren, Ellen and Bill, are here as well. And they haven't interrupted yet, so I assume I'm relatively on point. They're very polite as well, so I take it as it. He was very, well, I know he had a mustache early on. I think he lost, but apparently he didn't like children very much. Is that true? There was another man, also in great pain, in Atlanta, Georgia, at about the same time, named John Steve Pemberton, who had fought for South Carolina in the Civil War and had received a painful saber wound from which he suffered great agonies for the rest of his life. Don't worry, you know. And he became, oh dear, David, if I get too loud, you guys will just have to play louder. All right, no, it's just right on my mouth. How does this sound? Oh wait, that's not the problem. I've totally dislodged the mechanism. You know, I don't think Superman. You call yourself an artist. I'm good. So Pemberton was addicted to morphine, but he was also he was a scientist and a businessman. And he too turned to cocaine as a possible solution to his addiction. It didn't work. He ended up, at the end of his life, broke and addicted to morphine, and his son was addicted to opium, so we can go into the nature versus nurture issues. But what he produced was something called Pemberton's French wine coca. And it was a lethal combination of alcohol and cocaine, which made you feel great. And it was actually advertised as a kind of elixir for the upper classes of Atlanta, Georgia, doctors and lawyers and such, who were feeling the pressure of modern life. This is 1880 or so. What it really was, Pemberton's French wine, coca, was called that because it was designed to evoke a much more famous and successful wine called Vin Mariani, which was basically the toast of Paris at the time. It too was a concoction of red wine and cocaine, and alcohol and cocaine creates a very lethal combination. This stuff was seen as a kind of great panacea for everything. And Mariani was extremely aggressive in his advertising and quite progressive for the time. He relied on endorsements of celebrities with great prestige. Jules Verne and Alexander Dumas, amongst others, endorsed it, but not just hipsters like that. Pope Leo XIII apparently kept it in a hip flask for times when prayer, he said, was not efficacious, and he actually endorsed it in an advertisement and gave Mariani a gold medal. Alberto Santos Dumont, who we've talked about before, is the world's most famous aerialist at the time, the only person in history to have a private aircraft that he could fly from his home in a city anywhere he wanted. He kept a dirigible outside his house on the Champs-Élysées, and he would fly it to Maxim's, where he would drink Vin Mariani. He would take Vin Mariani up in his famous aeronautical exploits, and in his endorsement for the product, he said that 2 liquids were essential for navigating the air. One was petroleum to give energy to the machine, the engine, and the other was Vin Mariani, which gave energy to the pilot. Never married. But that's an interesting point. Bartoldi, the sculptor, said that if he had been drinking Vin Mariani when he had designed the Statue of Liberty, he would have made it 200 meters higher. And this is actually, it was advertised as a benefit for sexual prowess, or at least sexual interest. The promise of these products soon became tainted by the observation that if you drank too much Vin Mariani, you became basically both an alcoholic and a cocainist. And it rapidly lost its cachet, and he took out the cocaine, and then it just became cheap red wine. Pemberton had a somewhat similar but more complicated problem in Georgia. First, the local legislature outlawed, it was one of the first prohibitions of alcohol, was outlawed in the county of Atlanta. So he took the red wine out, left the cocaine in, and added sugar water, and began to advertise it as a temperance drink and a kind of health drink. He had a man working for him named Robinson, who was a advertising genius, and he's the one who came up with the name Coca-Cola, which was an alliteration, which was very popular. The Coca came from the cocaine, and the cola was a sort of misspelling of cola nut. It actually had cola nuts from Africa in it, which supplied caffeine. So he upped the sugar content, upped the caffeine content, and this stuff still packed a wallop, and it became a popular drink, unlike the Vin Mariani, which fell into disuse. Now, one of the interesting, so then Robinson is also the person who came up with the now famous logo, Coca-Cola, which is actually just, not just, but it's Spencerian script. It's the it was the script that was taught to any scrivener, any copyist in the 18th, 19th century United States, and you see it in other forms. The Ford logo is also in this space. When the Coca-Cola logo was attached to the first bottle of Coke, it had 3.5 grams of cocaine in it. And something happened, which was that when it was just being sold in the pharmacies in the South, they were segregated. And only the sort of elite, it was marketed as an elite drink for white professionals. And so whatever medicinal or recreational or sexual benefits it was supposed or actually supplying was seen as beneficial. As soon as the bottling companies got a hold of it, that meant anybody could drink it. And we see a kind of a resurgence of, the Jim Crow laws, white supremacy, all became impacted on the use of cocaine. This sort of vision of cocaine-crazed underclass attacking virginal white women became so appalling that the Coca-Cola company began removing cocaine from their products, and then tried their best to turn this into a kind of racist drink only for white people. The Pepsi-Cola company moved in with an aggressive marketing campaign. It had never had any cocaine in it, and it became known for decades as the black drink and Coca-Cola as the white drink. Coca-Cola tried to reverse this perception only in the 1950s by underwriting various progressive causes in the name of increasing their financial bottom line. What you see there in Adam's painting is the Exxon sign, excerpted. What I have here is the original notes written by Raymond Lowry, who was charged with coming up with this new design that was going to create this corporation which would stretch from sea to shining sea to sell gasoline to everyone within earshot. What he did, you can see, he experimented with various different combinations, and then he actually came up with this image which is sort of backwards of what we see now. But it's a double X. What it was replacing, I guess this came up in the conversation last week. In 1912 and 1911, I think, when we still hated corporations, they busted up Standard Oil and turned it into a series of smaller companies, including that were sort of subtly linked to each other. So Esso, the most popular brand, Esso Standard Oil, was sold in some states, and then Enco was sold in other states, energy company, and then there was the Humble brand, was kind of the parent company. They all had a similar logo, a blue circle with red lettering inside, and they used the same marketing campaigns, the same slogans, put a tiger in your tank, but people didn't make the association between them the way they would for their more national competition like Shell Oil or Texaco. So it was decided in the mid-60s that a new corporate name had to be devised that would pull them all into a single umbrella. Esso couldn't be used because they were prohibited from using this logo in certain states. Humble was too long. And Enco, as it turned out, in Japanese, sounded very much like Injin Kosho, which means stalled car or broken down engine, and that seemed inappropriate. So exon was a word that meant absolutely nothing in any language that people could tell, and it had a kind of similar feel to look to eso, and it was this drawing that I showed you was by a man named Raymond Lowery, who was born in Paris, but is sort of identified as a man who streamlined America. He also designed many corporate logos, like the Shell Corporation, but those highly stylized, sleek, late steam engines were his design. The Studebaker cars that looked like rockets were his design. He even designed a pencil sharpener that looked like a rocket ship. I always thought it was kind of interesting that he didn't design the original Coke bottle that we assume is the iconic form, but he did slim it down, and he did design the Coke machine dispenser, which was also supposed to look extremely futuristic, and to my eye looks oddly like another magic box that recently came into some disrepute. The Edison blocks that Theranos company designed to produce cheap, impossibly simple blood typing, but there's a direct design correlation between Coke machine and the Edison blocks. I was going to suggest to Tim that there are actually a number of cures over the years for hip pain, from alfalfa sprays to the inside bark of a willow tree, which contains salicylic acid that people used to take for hip pain. It's similar, same active ingredient as in an aspirin tablet. There's opium lettuce, wild opium lettuce you could use as well. You don't necessarily have to go all the way to sewing yourself up and replacing your hip joint. One of the great scourges of classical and early post-Christian era was something called the guinea worm. It was an infestation under the skin of these worms that caused incredible pain and blistering on the arm. And the way to deal with this was to cut a hole in the arm ahead of the progress of the worm. And when the worm would stick its head out, the physician would place a small stick in the way of the worm and then begin to slowly roll it up and draw it out of the arm. The process could take days or hours or weeks even, but this image became so associated with the successful healing of the body that the staff of Asclepius, the great god of healing, is in fact a snake wrapped around a stick. It may also be that snakes tended to be venerated as the generators of new life. In the United States and elsewhere, it's sometimes confused with a caduceus, which is two snakes wrapped around a single staff with wings above them. This is actually the symbol of Hermes, the Greek messenger god, but it was also an imprint on several medical textbooks, apparently, and a bureaucrat at the U.S. Medical Corps saw it on these medical textbooks and assumed this was the symbol of medical healing, and it became the logo for many medical institutions. But it really is just, I believe, Hermes throwing his stick between two fighting snakes and thereby solving the dispute between them, and became a symbol of a kind of international rapprochement between enemies. It was designed and built for Hermes by his lame half-brother Hephaestus, who was he had one bad leg and one good leg, and he was the god of all crafts. And he built the winged helmet and the shoes and the caduceus for his brother Hermes. His symbol was the hammer, often attached to a strong arm. And this symbol became associated with purity and virtue. The Vulcan Spice Company in early 19th century United States used this as their logo, presumably to advertise the purity and finely ground nature of their products. But the company did not survive and went bankrupt. The person who ran that company, Sterling, I believe, joined his father's business and brought the logo with him, and they manufactured baking soda. And the hammer became the logo for the baking soda, and then eventually identified so closely with the product that it became known as the Arm & Hammer baking soda product. We identify that, and I think this was a painting that Adam made in an earlier show with the. Oh, I forgot to mention something that I won't bore you with. They're all. Well, yeah. So the Arm & Hammer baking soda is often connected to a figure from American capitalist history named Arm & Hammer. Arm & Hammer was in fact completely unconnected to Arm & Hammer baking soda, we think, except that he was so taken by the connection he tried to buy the company. He didn't quite succeed in buying it, but he did become an active member of its board. He was, in fact, he said, named for the protagonist in another, the son of Alexander Dumas, who promoted Bin Mariani, wrote a book called Camille, or The Romance of Camille, about a prostitute who actually wore her own logo, a red rose, which indicated she was unavailable during certain parts of the month for connection, but a white camellia when she was available. Anyway, Armin was her lover. He became, in different names, they became the protagonists in the opera, Verdi's opera, La Traviata. And so that's who Arm & Hammer was named after, except that his father, Julius, was also the founder of the Communist Party of the United States and was well aware that the Arm & Hammer logo was the symbol of the Socialist Workers' Party. I'm getting this all from a previous catalog of Adam's work. And so this could have been a slight inside joke between the hammers. But it became something less of an empty joke when Julius died, leaving young Dr. Armand Hammer, just graduated from Columbia Medical School, with the responsibility of finishing a number of deals that Julius had started with the newly birthed Soviet Union. This is about 1921, and the Communist Workers' Paradise was not doing so well. They weren't producing enough tractors or seeds or fertilizer to feed their own the countrymen, so they needed to buy these materials from the West, and the United States was boycotting them at the time, but they identified Hammer as being someone who would be very useful to them as a conduit. And so he became fabulously wealthy, selling products from the West to the East. He also amassed a huge art collection along the way that started his gallery and underwrites the Hammer Museum in Los Angeles. He spent the rest of his life doing business with all sorts of unsavory characters, from Gaddafi to Mao Zedong. And when he did eventually acquire power in the Arm & Hammer Baking Soda Company, he put the Arm & Hammer logo on the back of his yacht, which he thought was a great joke on his history as a proto-socialist. Lenin is famous, of course, for saying, "We will sell the capitalists the rope that we will hang him with." It didn't quite work out that way. When I was teaching at the University of Iowa, I took my drawing class to the anatomy lab to draw cadavers, and I remember in the sort of field of bodies of the sort of brown, drying skin, there was one person who had had a hip replacement. In the center of this undifferentiated tissue was this perfect silver ball. It was very small. I think the joint used to be smaller because it was easier to implant and was considered less disruptive, but would have a tendency to slip out of place. But it was a very strange sight to see. It was almost like a little steel marble in the middle of this body, not moving, sort of like everything else orbiting around it. The University of Iowa cadaver lab is interesting because there's an art collection in there too. It's a series of prints by the artist Leonard Baskin, a figurative artist who was sort of interested in issues of body decay and mortality. There was one image in particular which is quite striking, which was a figure with all its veins and muscles are exposed, but its right hip is completely flayed and open. But it's called Hydrogen Man, and it's from 1954, and it's about, it's sort of addressing the great obsession of that time, which was our potential for annihilating ourselves with nuclear weapons, which you hardly ever think about anymore. he had an interesting, he was sort of completely committed to the body as his subject. He called it our human frame, our gutted mansion, our enveloping sack of beef and ash is yet a glory. I have a little bit of hip romance myself. I have a small tumor on one of my hips. The doctors say, not to be insulting, but that's really nothing remarkable about that. What I do have is a series of other tumors that have spotted up on the spine, and they have to be periodically irradiated in a kind of ongoing game of whack-a-mole. We're up to 2 or 3 at this point. But the hip looks pretty good so far. The hip is a big bone and it's a very small spot. But it just makes you wonder after a while of all these miraculous cures with pieces of steel or subatomic particles or chemical injections are really that salubrious. And so a few months ago, in the spirit of it can't really hurt, and plus the advice of a friend who seemed to feel this was helpful, I began going to see a healer who has all the self-confidence and assuredness that you would want to have in somebody who actually knew what they're talking about. But you sort of have to believe or it doesn't work. So I go to see him and he tells me, first of all, he puts me on a program of visualizations. Like, for the spine, imagine you're standing in a field and you're hit by a bolt of lightning, and you sort of have that sort of cartoon radiation. Your whole body becomes a skeleton, and then becomes opaque, and then the skeleton, and then opaque, and a skeleton, and then the bones are left white, except for these small dots. And then you take a golden brush and you scrub yourself, and all the spots fall away. So I've been trying that. And the last time I went to see him, he did something which he'd never done before, which is to say he was going to heal me by touch and prayer. And so I sit there wondering why I'm sitting there, and he sort of holds my hands. He says, look at my face. My face is going to transform as you watch. And that will be the power of prayer at work. So I'm looking, and of course, I believe that all of his techniques work on the power of suggestion, so I'm trying my best not to be suggestible. But he's a nice person, and of course you want to please them. So I'm really looking for signs that something is happening. I think he begins to squint a little bit, and I think, I don't see the whites of his eyes. Maybe his eyes have gone totally dark. And I say, I think your eyes have gone dark. And he says, yes, that's the power of prayer at work. Now the odd thing is, but then I always argue with him, and he tells me that as long as I argue with him, none of this is going to work, which sort of makes me feel bad on a couple of different levels. But the last time I went to see the doctors for my MRI scans, for the first time in 7 years, the tumors in the lungs not only hadn't grown, but were actually incrementally smaller. At least a few of them were. Not enough that any respectable doctor would say it was a significant event, but certainly enough for John to take credit for them and for me to be somewhat confused. So I thought we would try a remote visualization to aid Tim in his recovery, using some of the techniques that I've learned and apparently can put into effect now. So, collectively, with your eyes open or closed, imagine yourself standing at the edge of a forest, a jungle. You look into the jungle and you shout, "Help Tim." And from the jungle emerges a gigantic elephant. And the elephant reaches out and unscrews both of its tusks and hands them to you. And lo and behold, they are the femurs that Tim needs. You place them in the sockets where they snap into place in Tim's body, and he gets up and he begins to dance. And then this is very important. You have to thank the elephant, and then the elephant will smile and disappear back into the forest.
Audio message.
What's that?
You should send Tim an audio message.
Yeah, somebody should. I forgot to mention the upside down. Let's see. Well, I totally forgot to do the upside down bull's head. There are all sorts of symbols which are hidden in the in corporate logos, usually provided by the Illuminati. I brought a few examples. If you look at the Kleenex box upside down, you see the number 666 are embedded in that. Also, in the Chrome, Google Chrome, there's number 666 in there. My favorite, though, was our friend Winifred, who was driving through Philadelphia, and she said, why is everybody so pro-Catholic in this town? They said, why? They said, well, I see all these signs that say, Pope yes. Pope. So maybe that's there's a whole new insight into yet another level of manipulation. But this bull's hat, that Bill and I, the bull's hat is a benign secret message. It's it's a angry bovine with blood on its tips. But if you turn it upside down, it's a robot reading a magazine on a park bench. I don't know what that's.
We're not buying it.
It's a robot. Where did I did a drawing. Here, hand me that. See, you see the bull. There's the robot. You don't need to be persuaded by this. You just need to be seduced. You don't know that you're seeing that your robot masters have already plotted their capture of your consciousness. Anyway, thanks for coming. And thanks for being such a great ensemble. You really carried me along. Every time I felt I was losing it. And it actually worked a few times.